It had been a long time since we had seen Phyrexia, a decade since we had properly visited the Machine Kingdom. But finally, it was here. And no, I'm not talking about All Will Be One. I'm talking about 2011's new Phyrexia, coming hot on the heels of a huge battle in Mirrodin Besieged and the fake out of a potential Mirrodin pure set. This was the first time since Apocalypse we truly saw Phyrexia. On top of living weapon equipment and more poison, the set had a number of pretty memorably transgressive design directions. Cards that bled colors to feel more Phyrexian, like Vapor Snag and Psychic Barrier being blue cards that made an opponent directly lose life, and Beast Within giving green removal for anything. But most chief among these transgressive bleeds is a mechanic that led to staple cards and also banned cards: Phyrexian mana. Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast. And just as I was months away from leaving for a job at Wizards in October of 2011, new Phyrexia hit and changed the landscape of Magic forever. The addition of Phyrexian mana rippled through the game, impacting everything from standard to vintage Magic. Now, just in case you have no idea what I'm talking about, Phyrexian mana looks like this on cards. It means you can pay that mana or 2 life. There's even a card nobody remembers that references it directly in Rage Extractor. See, you probably didn't remember it. If you did, you can post your triumph in the comments. Anyway, when I say Phyrexian mana impacted the entire game, that's not just hyperbole here. I remember watching Mental Misstep become an immediate 4-copy staple in Legacy, with mini decks containing not even one blue source playing 4 copies just to fight over 1-drops. Meanwhile, in one of the strongest standard formats in history, with Compleated at the top, Birthing Pod entered a new dangerous deck into the fray, while Spellskite joined forces with the Caw-Blade Menace to take removal spells away from Stoneforge Mystic, and Phyrexian Metamorph could copy swords or creatures. Oh, and Dismember, that saw play all over as a 1-mana removal spell and still does in many formats to this day. The fervor in the Magic community at the time immediately turned to how Phyrexian mana was a mistake. New Phyrexia had 26 cards with Phyrexian mana in their mana costs, plus some other cards with it in activated abilities. Of those cards, I count 15 that have seen serious constructed play at one point or another, including 3 that eventually got banned entirely. Mental Misstep was banned in Modern as soon as the format was created in August 2011, and Legacy was not far behind in September, just a few months after the set was released. Birthing Pod got the axe from Modern in 2015. Rest in peace, Pod. And Gitaxian Probe survived all the way until 2017, when it got banned in Modern, restricted in Vintage, and then over the next couple of years, axed in Legacy and Pauper as well. Phyrexian mana was, to put it lightly, a disaster. What went wrong here? The design team for new Phyrexia wanted to be transgressive. Phyrexia was here, and you should be able to feel it. They tried all kinds of mechanics, even one called, and please remember this was the year 2011, Pwnage, which let you shuffle cards from your opponent's library into yours. Transgressive indeed, though the faint traces of that mechanic did survive as one card, sort of, in Praetor's Grasp. But there was another mechanic, even more ambitious and wild than Pwnage, and at the handoff from the set into what was then called development, entering the final stages of design, the mechanic was killed. I don't think we've ever talked about what the mechanic was before, but I feel good telling you now that what Ken Nagel had come up with was a mechanic called Link. It let you combine 2 cards together to make one awesome card. A mechanic that would eventually have its day, as Ken Nagel got a version of it into Eldritch Moon as the Meld mechanic, and later on had a run in Unstable as Host and Augment. Anyway, design now had to scramble to come up with a replacement for Link. They were given 4 restrictions. First, the mechanic had to feel Phyrexian. That was crucial. Second, the mechanic needed to not be parasitic. For those who don't know all our lingo, a parasitic mechanic gets better the more of it you put in your deck. For example, Infect is a parasitic mechanic. Third, the card needed a visual component. It should be something with visual appeal that felt Phyrexian. And finally, fourth, the mechanic needed to work at common. It couldn't be something which would only be on higher rarity cards. The team put their heads together and came back with Phyrexian mana, a straightforward but effective for the goals mechanic. The very first pitch was to just do it on generic mana, before eventually moving it to be on colored mana instead. They showed the mechanic around and people got on board. It was late in the process, but the new mechanic was added and cards were rapidly worked on. It was much in line with the color bleeds of the set, like on Vapor Snag and Beast Within. Any deck could get an effect if they were willing to pay life for it. It certainly felt evil and transgressive, and well, they certainly weren't wrong. The team did it with the best of intentions, but as we saw time play out, this implementation of Phyrexian mana ended up among our greatest mistakes. So what went wrong? Yes, the cards were powerful, but it's more than just that. One problem with Phyrexian mana is how it's used as a cost reduction mechanic. Now, clearly we can do cost reduction mechanics without them being broken. We've done ones that worked out fine before, like Affinity. Actually, I meant the Urza block untap land spells. Okay, how about Offering? Fox Offering turned out just fine. But seriously, cost reduction can be just fine. However, when what you're trading is life, that's where the problem comes in. Among the first things you learn as you level up at competitive Magic is that your life total is a resource. Winning at 1 is the same as winning at 20. So, as a result, paying life for earlier power in the game becomes a cost it is generally correct to pay. Trading life for time is usually worth it, given how much it can expedite your gameplay toward winning. And with Phyrexian mana, there's no other deck building condition. You just pay the life. But at a fundamental level, this can cause some problems, because you should usually do it. But if it doesn't work out, you're in doubly bad shape. Take the limited common Thundering Tanadon for a great example. On turn 4, you should usually just pay the 4 life and slam this card down. Having a 5/4 this turn is way better than waiting a turn. And you aren't playing this card in your deck to have a 6 mana 5/4 trample, you know? But the problem inherent with that play pattern is if they remove your Tanadon, you're not just down your creature, you're down 4 life too. It all adds up. And all of this leads into another problem. It's a very spiky mechanic. Spike, for reference, is our stand-in for the competitive player who loves to win. Spike loves maximizing their chances of winning by being willing to throw life at the problem. That's great. Perfectly enough, as a nod to this, even Spike's uncard representation uses Phyrexian mana. But not everyone is Spike, and paying life on its face doesn't sound appealing at all. And for a mana discount, no thanks, I'll just wait a turn. The end result is that Spike realized this is a great deal, while a lot of players who are either not as competitively attuned or just newer to the game held their cards to not toss their life away. And guess who won those games? Phyrexian mana is a powerful mechanic and appealing to people who like power, but it was not an appealing mechanic beyond just this is powerful. To make matters worse, it introduced a bunch of free spells into the game, which tend to engender very competitive environments. Getting got when your opponent is tapped out feels like you're getting cheated and generally takes away one of the things Magic lets you trust. If your opponent is tapped out, you know everything that's going on. That became a lie even in Limited. And finally, of course, a big one, color pie breaks. Every color suddenly had a counterspell and a removal spell. Surgical Extraction? Yep, sure, everybody can get one of those too. This is both dangerous from a preserving the color pie standpoint, as well as a competitive balance standpoint. If any of these cards turned out too strong, they'd show up everywhere, as Mental Misstep did in Legacy. It's incredibly problematic. Now, I'm going to say something here that I personally believe. Not everybody in design would necessarily agree with this, but I feel like the biggest offenders here are the instants and sorceries, and here's why. Every color gets artifacts. If you want to clone, yes, Phyrexian Metamorph is best in class, but you could easily imagine a 5 mana artifact clone being fine. Birthing Pod could have been a colorless artifact at a more appropriate rate. Porcelain Legionnaire? Sure, I could imagine a 2 mana 3/1 first strike where you lose 2 life. Those are all permanents. But spells? That's something irreplicable. Artifacts wouldn't give you a free counterspell or combat trick, or a 1 mana -5/5 removal spell. This is where the color pie most ends up broken and problematic. I'm curious, do you agree or disagree with this take? You can let me know in the comments down below. But either way, I hope we can all agree the mechanic had some problems. So we did it in New Phyrexia, and it would never be seen again. Right? Enter Phyrexia All Will Be One design. It's been over a decade since New Phyrexia, and the design team has the task to bring Phyrexia once again to life. And naturally, the place to start is looking at what we did in New Phyrexia. Poison makes sense, and it comes back to eventually be used as toxic. Proliferate returns as well to work alongside that mechanic. Even Living Weapon gets its mirror image in 4 Mirrodin. But what of Phyrexian mana? And there's a design conundrum. Because on one hand, it's one of the most remembered things from the previous block. On the other hand, it's remembered in part because of how titanic of a mistake it was. That was going to be a tough needle to thread. Keeping the problems in mind, the team tried colorless Phyrexian mana. It solved the color bleed issue, but still had many of the problems listed above. After a lot of iteration, they did find a happy medium. Phyrexian mana would appear on permanents, but not in mana costs. Genius. If some of the problems were that it was usually right to accelerate out your spells using life and that they broke color identity, putting it in abilities only is an excellent way to curtail that problem. You still need to play the permanent at its normal pace and the normal color it fits into, and then you can choose when to activate it. And there's far more of a decision around if you want to activate it or not. And so you see Phyrexian mana on the 5 Dominuses as well as Unctus. It was just a little touch to get it into the set without causing a ton of problems. And note, they're all permanents. And then, in March of the Machine, we evolved the same trick by putting it on activated abilities of different colors than the creature they were on. It feels transgressive, but the abilities still mostly feel within the spirit of their color. And instead of just turboing out your spell early, it gives you an interesting choice. Sometimes you're not playing the color, and sometimes you are. These played well, and they add just a little bit of extra texture into the set. Now, you might have been yelling at your screen, what about Compleated on Planeswalkers? We saw this first in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty with Tamiyo, and it showed up in these other sets as well. After all, Phyrexian mana shows up in their mana costs. Well, a couple things. First of all, note the careful use of it to make sure we don't break color requirements here. Tamiyo still requires green and blue to cast, completed or not. Nissa, in All Will Be One, still requires green mana instead of just reducing it down to 0 green. Second, here it functions quite a bit different than Phyrexian mana normally does, because it does have a real cost besides life. The 2 fewer loyalty downgrades your card in a meaningful way, as opposed to a card like Phyrexian Metamorph. That's the same effect whether you reduce its cost or not. It's a way to use that Phyrexian symbol to show the Phyrexianization of the character, all while not breaking color pie. So we did it. We saved Phyrexian mana, right? Phyrexian mana in New Phyrexia is certainly on our list of largest mistakes, but I think it's fair to call it more of a development and implementation error than a pure design mistake. It can work, as we've seen in the past couple sets, even if the way we did it in New Phyrexia was not the way to go. It's always an amazing feeling to rehabilitate a mechanic that was a disaster before. And viewed this way, it could look like a huge triumph. We could end this video on a high note. Nice job, us. And seriously, great work to the teams who made it happen. But all that said, in my personal design opinion, I'm still no fan of Phyrexian mana. It's a long walk for a short drink of water. If the best we can get out of it is a handful of activations on cards, that doesn't ring of success to me. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it was right to bring back an All Will Be One to keep that Phyrexian through line, and to show as the catalyst for Phyrexian transformation in March of the Machine. It was even a phenomenal way to show completed Planeswalkers, and I'm glad we did it. But at the end of the day, you can't fight the problem that 2 life for a mana is not going to excite a wide audience, and it's a recipe that's made with strength and excitement mixed in the wrong proportions. Just because you can make something work a couple times doesn't mean it's a great thing to try and make work often. So I wouldn't expect to see much Phyrexian mana anytime soon. Not only because the name is tied to Phyrexia and they've got a whole situation right now, but the main reason we brought the mechanic back is because it would be a player expectation of a Phyrexian invasion and return to new Phyrexia. That said, someday in the future, when and if the Phyrexians do return, I can't help but imagine we'll be having the same discussions, uncorking the bottle on an extremely scary mechanic once more, taking all these lessons into account. And when that time comes, I'll be ready to help pour an oily glass of it. But what do you think? Would you like to see more Phyrexian mana in the future, or should it stay buried? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'll be reading and very curious. I'll talk with you again soon. And until then, may you enjoy your oily glass of Phyrexian mana. You got this, Training Grounds. I went back and looked at the developer history, and this card had an interesting path here. It started as an uncommon green aura that could enchant a single creature and make its abilities cost less to use. Pretty narrow and definitely not worth a card. Then it got moved to a green enchantment, like you see here, and